Well, good afternoon, everybody. I must say it's a great pleasure to welcome you here at ACE Events, our facilities in the center of Brussels, near Rond-Point Schuman, where you can have conferences, webinars, broadcasting, or a mix of the three as you'd like. My name is Olivier Boutelis. I'm the Chief Executive of Accountancy Europe, and I have the great pleasure today of being joined by Heidi Hautala, Vice President of the European Parliament. If you want to know the long list of responsibilities that Mrs. Hautala is having in the Parliament, I will invite you to go straight to her online CV, because that would take too long, I think, to go through today. Before we start our conversation on sustainability and corporate governance, which is our topic today, I'd just like to take care of a couple of housekeeping issues. You can ask questions to Mrs. Hautala, and you can ask your questions at any time through Slido, sli.do, and the meeting code is SCG, not SDGs, SCG. So we will look at your questions. The only issue is that we may not be able to answer all of the questions depending on how successful we are today with your questions. So Heidi, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today. We're going to be talking, and it's really a fireside conversation, just missing the fire with us, about corporate governance and sustainability. But maybe you would like to set the scene a little bit for us today and tell us about how you see the sustainability challenge that humankind is facing today.
Yeah, thank you. It's also for me a great pleasure and honor to be here with you on the fireside talk without the fire. But I'm sure that we can create some inspiration in our talk. So I would think that, and this is very much my inspiration for the last years, that I realized that it's inevitable that we need the corporate world and the private sector to be a part of the transformation so that we do not continue to exceed what we could now call the planetary boundaries, and that we also respect the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, which, by the way, had its 10th anniversary on the 16th of June. For me, a great celebration, because I realized 10 years ago when I read about this decision by the UN Human Rights Council that indeed it was something completely groundbreaking, that while the governments and states would still have the responsibility to protect human rights, companies would have the duty to respect them. And I think what we are seeing now in and around the EU, but also in other parts of the world, is that now there's a great call for corporate accountability, transparency, and sort of a co-creation of meeting these global challenges that we have. So it has to be an interplay between the states, the companies, and the civil society, and all sort of different stakeholders that corporations have around them.
It's very interesting you outlined this anniversary indeed, because I don't know if you feel the same, but recently it happens to me very often that listening to, let's say, the OECD, the IMF, I mean, what a lot of people used to look like as the temple of orthodoxy, I would say, and you hear them talk and you're like, is this an NGO talking or is this really the OECD? So it seems that the mood has changed, no?
I feel the same. I often have to pinch myself because I realize that how deep this transformation that we understand we need to have is. And there's a lot of genuine will to find the best tools and the best ways of be a part of that transformation, also by corporations. And indeed, OECD has, by the way, always been a front runner of integrating different policy areas. So I would say that I'm not even so surprised about that. But what was a big surprise for me was that the European Commission became so vigorously insistent on implementation of what we call the European Green Deal. which means that we have to extend this idea of sustainability to basically to all policy areas. And that's a challenge for administrations because they usually work in silos. And of course, we see it still very much, even in the EU and in the Commission. But I think they are learning to look at things in an integrated way, and that's necessary. Otherwise, we will be just sort of wasting resources and mental energy and not really find the right solutions.
Indeed, indeed. And I think this approach has been developing and growing in business as well. I think it was a year and a half ago now that even in the United States of America, under the previous administration, the Business Roundtable actually made a very strong statement on the importance of sustainability, stakeholders inclusion, and corporate governance. So coming to corporate governance, I mean, what in your view is the role that corporate governance should play into the necessary transformation of basically the way we live on the planet and therefore the way we do business?
Corporate governance sometimes is seen as something very holy and protected, that it's an area where sometimes it's felt that the states are maybe interfering even too much in business. But I think it's also correct, and this has to be done together with corporations, because obviously companies understand best how in practice promote certain societal demands. But I do see that we are in a kind of a breaking moment in the sense that there is this idea of resetting the economy, there's sustainable finance, and if this is not reflected in corporate governance, I think many companies will be a bit lost. I of course see that the front runners are there already. They have very good practices, and they are completely in line what, for instance, the UN guiding principles show. But they don't have a level playing field, and that's what I hear very, very often these days, is that companies are calling for a level playing field. And this is to protect the front runners who have understood that they can and they shall transform their own activities and structures so that they can really, in an integrated way and at the highest corporate level, address these challenges. But there's also resistance. I was a bit taken back, I would say, by a letter that the Nordic employers' organizations chiefs sent to the Financial Times a couple of months ago, where they kind of warned that the European Commission is planning some sort of NGO takeover of a corporate world. I would say that is a little bit too colorful for me, because what we can see is that what we are trying to talk about is that it's all very important for companies and their leadership to understand what's going on in the society, how they affect the society, how the society affects them. This is what we call the boring double materiality. Yeah. And there seems to be resistance to this, and some corporations even, I think, unduly believe that their critics are their enemies. They should be considered their best friends, because they get a lot of essential information from these dialogues and consultations. So I don't think we are in the middle of any kind of NGO takeover of the corporate world. But the civil society has strong views, because they feel that we cannot achieve our global challenges and solutions without the corporate world.
It's very interesting what you're saying, actually, because 2 years ago now, Accounts Europe published a kind of reflection paper on corporate governance, and we were saying exactly the same thing as you said on the level playing field. There are a lot of admirable front runners in business, really, and in all honesty, I tend to think that business has done much on this issue, maybe even more than governments at times. But front runners can't be expected to continue the race in front if the rest of the gang is not following.
Yes.
So indeed, I think the level playing field issue is very important. And at Accounts Europe, actually, we've been working on the old sustainability issue, just to give you an idea, for more than 25 years. So it's not really a new issue for us. But the other thing that strikes me in what you just said is that it seems that we continue effectively seeing this as almost a political or ideological issue. I mean, you're an MEP, so you belong to a political party.
Yeah.
From my viewpoint, this is a fact. I mean, science is giving us a lot of very worrying warnings on the state of the planet, on the state of climate, on the state of water, on the state of whatever indicator. So I don't think this is a political discussion. I think this is really something that we all collectively have to look into, no?
I think the younger generations automatically realize that this is the case, and they are quite rightly worried about their future and the future of their children. And I think some of the most striking things that we see now happening is that, for instance, I give you this example that is now very, let's say, noticed, that a Dutch court accepted the challenge by an environmental group called Milieudefensie, and 17,000 people who participated in a class action against Royal Dutch Shell. And it's been said that it was the first time ever, the 26th of May 2021, that a court accepted that such a multinational company had responsibility about their value chain, all the way to the Nigerian oil drilling fields, where they had caused damage to people and livelihoods and the environment, of course. So I like to see this as a rising example that we're sort of, there's a bit of like a new air in customary law, you know, this kind of random court judgments, which we see now, I would say almost every month. Courts are saying that policymakers and companies must do more to protect the planet and people. So, of course, this is a message to the lawmakers that, you know, we shouldn't be reliant on random court rulings. We should be sort of putting in place the let's say, the framework that people are invited to be a part of the solutions, also the corporations. So I see this as a very revolutionary moment, actually, at the moment.
Yeah, indeed. And you know, if you can talk a little bit about what's happening in the European Parliament on that. You've been the author of, as shadow rapporteur, of an initiative report on corporate governance and social responsibility. But can you give us some insight of how your colleague MEPs from other parties look at that, and what is your message basically in the Parliament?
Yeah, it's indeed, we're talking about 2 or 3 parliamentary reports, which we call own initiative. It means that we were not asked by anybody to do this. The Parliament decided to do it. First was a colleague called Delara Burkhardt, a young German social democrat, who drafted a report on how to tackle deforestation in global value chains. And the second was one on sustainable corporate governance by a French Renew member from the Macron party, Pascal Durand. And then we had the one on accountability and corporate due diligence by a Dutch social democrat called Lara Wolters. And we are a group of MEPs across the party lines, which have been sitting together a lot, tens and tens and tens of hours together, also talking to the stakeholders, industries, corporations, civil society, on how the European Union now could set the scene for global standards by being a frontrunner as a lawmaker on corporate accountability. It's been a great experience, and it continues because it was also a learning process, because we had to understand how our plans on including stakeholders in company processes, how the due diligence process should be designed so that it makes sense for the companies in action. So we couldn't just say that, okay, this is how we want it, but through a lot of exchanges, a certain model arose, and now we have some concerns that the European Commission is not really as ambitious as we would like to see it to be. I give you one example. The Parliament was very clear after a lot of discussions that we need to have the whole value chain in the scope of what is required of the companies. That and well, it's very obvious that if you look at cocoa production or textile production, it's often at the very beginning of the process on the ground, you know, in the plantation or on the factory floor or even in the cotton field, that you have the biggest issues relating to environment and human rights. And now some would like to see this sort of cut. And I see that many companies are worried because if they are accountable for the value chain, they have to understand all the way from the beginning to the end, you know. So I hope that the European Commission is not compromising on this, because it would in a way dilute the whole exercise into very little of value.
So are you saying that this is almost a non-partisan issue in the Parliament?
It's not entirely non-partisan, because we see that at least at the beginning of the debates, let's say the traditionally sort of pro-corporate, pro-market parties have been, let's say, they have questions about whether companies really need to be directed in this way. But the more companies participate in the discussion, the more the message go through those more or less, let's say, center-right, right-wing parties who consider themselves to be the friends of business. And now we understand that what does it mean to be a friend of business, that we can sort of create together a framework where we will also manage to save this planet and its people. So it's becoming less of a partisan issue, but it has been a partisan issue to some extent, yes.
Which is consistent with the evolution of the discourse that, you know, we referred to in the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank. I mean, if you want to be friend to your friends, you got to be friend to business and friends to the planet as well, I suppose, today.
Right? Exactly.
So coming down to corporate governance, I mean, so far this has very much been seen as an issue that is very much influenced by culture, different legal frameworks, and therefore an issue that is to be probably left in the hands of self-regulation at national level, to be dealt with by voluntary codes and so on and so forth. You know the debate, you had this debate in the Parliament. So how do you see the case for change actually in that space? What makes you think that it is now time to change? Beside, of course, the level playing field argument that you mentioned, which I think is very important indeed.
The European Commission has been criticized a lot by certain elements in the corporate world, that it is not true that companies on average would still be focused on short-termism, short-term profits. So they got a lot of criticism on this. But then, for instance, if you look at how little corporate accountability and sustainability figure in remuneration of companies, then you realize that it really, for many companies, still it is a kind of a second-class issue to deal with officials at, you know, definitely not at the corporate, the board level. So I think there should be some incentives for companies to incorporate sustainability in the remuneration systems. And of course it would be great if companies would not need to be invited by law to set up certain structures, like a committee that is looking into the sustainability aspects and very integrated to the board. But I'm afraid this needs some action, and this is perhaps the tough part, which companies often do not support. At the same time, as I said, we clearly see that sustainability is not a cross-cutting issue at the highest level for many corporations yet.
It's interesting you talk about short-term, because that's something that you know always puzzled me in a way. Because if you look at some companies that do very long-term investments and that do plan on very long-term, just take the example of oil company. I mean, in oil and gas, you have to plan your investment on a very long term in a way. And I don't think they're really part of the most sustainable companies, aren't they?
Yeah, that's a nice paradox to mention that
Yeah.
indeed. But then we, at the same time, we may realize at the moment that these companies may face stranded investments at a certain point. And then the question, of course, arises that how much should the companies themselves be aware of such, let's say, long-term risks that will affect them? Maybe let's call them non-financial risks, which will put them in a very dire situation also financially. But as an accountancy profession, I believe that this is very much at the heart of what you're discussing.
Indeed. And before going there, I think there is another paradox with the short term, which is that we're again always talking about short-termism and etc., etc. The reality is that if I remember the report of the IPCC from 2018, I think it was, they were basically talking about an emergency that we need to deal with in the next 10 years. Is that the short term or the long term?
Yeah, thanks. That's a nice challenge. I like that because it's true that that what we are now gathering from the best world-class research and virtually undisputed, more and more undisputed, is that these next 10 years, it sounds almost magical, but let's say until 2030, we still have time to put in place the mechanisms, and we have to undertake the transformation now, because if we haven't done that by around 2030, then we will risk to face a very serious collapse of our, let's say, the protective systems of our planet. I often study what Professor Johan Rockström, the director of the Potsdam Climate Change Research Institute, says that we are facing a situation where a tipping point of about one of the 9 protective systems on our planet, if there will be a tipping point, then there could be a very dangerous domino effect. If the summer ice in the Arctic is now becoming virtually non-existent, and then that might again have an impact on the climate systems elsewhere, Gulf Stream, all that, Amazon could become dry. So it is true that I have to confess that we need this type of short-termism to address these long-term. Well, in fact, everything is quite near now, and yes. So let's undertake this transformation, and I'm very curious about your profession, how you see it, and how accountancy can be accompanying this transformation and even be at the leading edge.
Well, I think I mentioned that sustainability has been a priority for Accountancy Europe for a number of years now. And we have been working heavily on, of course, environmental accounting, on sustainability reporting, on integrated reporting, on assurance on sustainability matters. Because I think that is really important that, just to give you an example, actually, the chief executive of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development used to always say that accountants will save the world. Well, I'm not sure that's possible, but at least I think what he meant to say is very interesting, because it really means that we have to measure what we do to be able to manage our businesses. And that is a very important element of corporate governance as well. I think with accounting, reporting, and audit, accountants are providing one of the key enablers of corporate governance. So that's something that we've been very heavily involved in for a number of years, and we're working right now on the CSRD that the Commission has just published. I think a piece of legislation that we've been very supportive of, and I hope that it has a smooth ride in the Parliament, because we need this piece of legislation quite quickly, I believe. So I don't know what's your take on that, but do you think, how do you see it going in the Parliament?
We certainly, let's say that this cross-party group of MEPs, we welcome the Commission's initiative, and I was delighted to see that we don't anymore talk about non-financial reporting. We talk
Yes.
about sustainability reporting. I mentioned this small delight of mine to the Commission officials, and they said, "Oh, that was a very small confession to make." But it needs to be beefed up a bit, I think. And one thing is that it needs to be somehow synchronized with the forthcoming proposal on the corporate due diligence.
Right.
As we see it, is that in that piece of legislation, that's the sort of what the companies need to pay attention to, what are the risks for each of them, and what they need to report on. And then one jumps to the CSRD. And but do you think that there is a momentum for the EU to help to put in place a global reporting standard? This is a big debate, I understand, among yourselves. And there are those who say that this is necessary. I think most people would say that we need a global standard for global businesses, global markets. But the risk is that there could be several which are not very well integrated. But what is the stake?
I think that is indeed quite an interesting debate and a very topical one right now, with on the one hand the Commission announcing and asking EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, to start work on a sustainability standard, and on the other hand the IFRS Foundation that is also setting up a sustainability reporting board. And I think it's the same thing as what you mentioned on the evolution of the discussion in the Parliament. I think it is time we all work together. This is just too serious an issue to have different competing, overlapping initiatives. But I think we need to be clear also on what it is that we're trying to do. And I think the IFRS Foundation is trying to provide the reporting that is of interest to investors for global financial markets. I think the EU is taking things a step forward, a step further, I would say, looking at how to address more stakeholders than only investors, looking at this double materiality that you mentioned earlier, and also looking at having a tool ensuring the transparency on the way that purely European regulation is being implemented and enforced. So personally, I see the two initiatives are complementary. What we will need to be very careful about is actually to avoid overlap or inconsistency into fundamental standards. And that's why at Accountancy Europe, we encourage the EU and international standard setters to coordinate and work together. But I think we also very clearly recognize that there are differences in scope and ambition. And I think that's part of the equation in a way.
Do you see that the understanding of corporate sustainability reporting would be arising also on other continents? Like, is there anything going on in Asia? Because it seems to me that until now we talk mainly about European and maybe US-based companies, but maybe I'm not quite on track.
Well, it's quite interesting when you travel, although you don't travel anymore these days, but when you're in front of your screen at home and talk to people on other continents, I'm always struck by the admiration for the political courage that the EU and the European Commission and Parliament are showing. So I think this is being picked up. You've got jurisdictions like Japan that are also very aware of the challenge, I think, and also very interested and supportive of the work that is taking place. So this is, I think, this is happening. I mean, there is a lot of debate on China, of course, as always, but we see, the commitments that they start making on the emissions that they produce while producing the goods that we consume, usually, something that is a little bit forgotten as well. but we know that when usually they decide to change, they do change pretty quickly. So let's see how this all unfolds. But indeed, I think there is now raising global awareness across the continent. We as a profession are a global profession, I would say. And we have we have global standards on auditing, we have global standards on ethics, we're applying global financial standards, and I think we look forward to developing standards and supporting the development of relevant standards at global and EU level with the different purposes that they may have. So yeah, I think that is a very important development that is taking place now, really.
Yeah, I share your let's say your observation that the EU is being observed and that the European actors, because I truly believe that we may be at the verge of what we would call another Brussels moment. that what is being created now here, of course not in a vacuum, not isolated from the world, could become a pathway to global standards, and certainly the UN guiding principles on business and human rights were supposed to be a global practice, a global standard. But what worries me is that we also would need to extend all this to developing countries. And we see that one of the big drivers of what's going on now is that we as consumers are very wary of being complicit in deforestation or child labor. For me, it's not enough that we kind of cleanse our own supply chains as consumers and countries, but I'm becoming more and more sort of alerted to the fact that we need to sort of involve development cooperation. With all the tools that we have in that area in the EU and its member states and of course other countries as well. So for me it would be an important debate now that how can we make sure that that all this reaches the ground, the actual work, actual lives of people who work in very dire conditions and in spoiled environments, partly because of corporations, but we need to sort of see that these countries in Africa and Latin America, Asia, that they also simply start to develop a better governance which is able to provide education, health, a cleaner environment. And that's why I'm very happy to see that in the EU Commission, several commissioners are very involved with this work.
Yeah.
At least 4 or 5 of them very actively. And I hope that they will not dilute the ambition.
And the dialogue with the new US administration seems to be back on track, so all that is good news in a way. But if we bring back, if we focus back on corporate governance, can I ask you the €1 million question? Because we were expecting a proposal, and I see we've got a question actually coming from the audience on that. But I think we were expecting a proposal from the European Commission, from Commissioner Reinders, and it seems that it's been postponed and that the new commissioner is also coming into the play. Do you have any insight on that? Can you tell us more on what's happening?
I think there's 2 things. Let's say that the good news, and there will be the bad news as well, but the good news is that this is, of course, a sort of a multi-sectoral, cross-sectoral exercise, which means that the more sort of sectors need to be engaged, from trade to environment, from commerce to justice, and so on. So it's good that what comes out of the European Commission is kind of taking into account all these different aspects properly, and that's why we have what we call regulatory scrutiny board that seems to have had a negative opinion on what they were offered. But the bad news is that the longer we take in this, the likelihood that some of the more, let's say, resistant conventional business circles interfere in the game and say that this is not what we need, this is not what we want. And I'm afraid this is also happening now. So I think Accountancy Europe, lots of different actors, progressive companies, like the chocolate industry. The big chocolate producers have said that they do not want a delay on this legislation because they have a history of dozens and dozens of voluntary standards, and that doesn't help them in their efforts to eradicate child labor and deforestation. So I think it's time to be a bit vocal now if we want to see a progressive legislation which really sort of encompasses the whole value chain of the company. And for those who are worried, I think we need to emphasize over and over again that there is a principle of proportionality. That
Right.
it's not every little detail that will take you to court against a worker from Africa. It's not like that. We always repeat that the companies need to focus on the most salient risks and study them carefully and see how they can mitigate. And this is very much in cooperation with the different stakeholders.
You're actually anticipating on a question from the audience, because I think when we're looking at the proposals on corporate governance, what is usually the source of concern in business is what will effectively be compulsory, will be mandated, and how detailed this is going to be. I mean, we at Accountancy Europe are fairly clear on that. I mean, we think it is principles and outcomes that need to be made clear and need to be embedded in legislation. But legislation is probably not the tool to go, as you very rightly said yourself, into all the details. But I think this is really the source of worry that we understandably see from business. So what is your recommendation to the Commission on the scope of what needs to be mandated?
Well, it's a scope. It's a scope that the value chain it has to be kept sort of whole, because otherwise you lose the transparency and you don't see what is in it. Then it's necessary, I think, to understand that the size of a company is not a defining factor for size of the company is not what defines what risks there are for the environment and human rights. So I think what the European Parliament, after long debate, proposed is that all listed companies and all big companies and smaller companies in risky areas. Well, I know we are entering into a difficult debate because we wanted the European Commission to define the risky areas, but I can tell you from interactions with so many different people that it's possible, for instance, to see that agribusiness and mining are very risky businesses where risks are really, they are sort of there. So, and then on this sort of, let's say, corporate governance, my favorite idea is that there should be an obligation for companies to set, to include sustainability in the remuneration criteria, because that would be a real trigger of a kind of a top-down process in the company. But I don't think it's necessary to define what kind of bodies companies should establish for being able to address the sustainability challenges, because if it's a smart company, it knows itself, and if it doesn't do that, then things just may go horribly wrong. So these are the things that I'd like to
It's
see.
interesting your comment on size, because it seems that you've been reading our website and the different papers that we've been publishing, saying exactly the same thing, that it is all about risk and proportionality rather than just size, indeed. So that's an interesting point. I think some leading companies are starting to integrate sustainability factors in remuneration. So there will be an important role, I think, for the remuneration committee on the board. But I think there is an equally important role here on the quality of information that is being used in the interest of those who are being remunerated on these bases and the company. I think it's very important that we have good information, reliable information.
What would guarantee such a good quality information, and how should it be verified?
Well, companies obviously will have to change their processes on the production of information and sustainable information. I think we recently had an event on the role of audit committees in this respect
Yes,
that you kindly concluded and attended. And I think audit committees have a very important role to
I
play here.
completely agree, and it's in all companies already.
Yeah,
So it could, and talking to board professionals, I hear some of them say that training is important.
yeah,
Training and the presence of qualified people in boards, and there we can see that this little revolution, well, it's a big revolution that happened in ExxonMobil the other week,
indeed.
that 2 or 3 board members were elected who are particularly qualified in addressing climate change and let's say redirecting and reorienting such a company like ExxonMobil towards more accountability and sustainability. So expertise, training are really important, and I was delighted to hear from some board professionals that they say that people involved in this type of exercises, they need to be able to speak sustainability, which means that it's a perhaps we can say that it's a language, but it's not. It's also a kind of a way of seeing how different aspects of sustainability, human rights, governance, environment, how they are related to each other. So away from silos, more towards integrated views.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, but it's interesting to see how in Western science and Western philosophy we have started segmenting everything, making small compartments where we put everything, while everything is connected in reality. So this is largely artificial, I think, in a way. And what I believe will be important moving forward on boards is to have sustainability integrated into the boardroom at large, not necessarily having one person standing there for a cause. I think that is really not what it's all about. But it's interesting also to see how the market is responding, because you may remember a few months ago seeing a survey that got a lot of attention. I think it was New York University doing it and saying that there is a terrible climate incompetence in boards in the US. And it is in the US and one of its largest oil companies that you see the change.
Yes.
So change is happening. And a lot of this change is driven by the market, actually. So I think that also brings us back to the question of what needs to be mandatory and what needs to be left to the market. And that's why we believe that it is very important that we are clear on the principles and the outcomes, but not go into very detailed prescriptive requirements.
I definitely agree with you on that. And I believe that the most important thing now in what we are expecting from the EU is that this due diligence process is described well. And then it should be left to the companies to arrange, how they want to achieve that. But the steps of the due diligence process, which means that they have to have the capacity, the competence to look into the value chain. And here, as lawmakers, we can make sure that it's not just sort of put into pieces, this value chain.
So that brings us back to another controversial question that is emerging from the questions from the audience as well, on directors' duties. And do you think directors' duties should be increased? I'm sure you've heard the argument that if directors' liability is increased, nobody will want to be a director anymore and companies will be left without any directors. What is your take on that? Where is the balance between duties and liabilities?
When we talk about individual liabilities, I think it's not so clear how that could be arranged, but the board as a whole should make sure that they are able to prove that they have followed the due diligence process and that they have taken the steps seriously, and that when they faced issues, I mean, there are issues in every supply chain. There's something going wrong, and that they then have undertaken to mitigate those risks, and then they should be protected from, we can call it due diligence defense, in fact. But I would also like to say that at the same time, if we go, I always go back to the UN guiding principles.
Right.
The third pillar, access to justice. Actually, one of the most important aims of the objectives of all this is that when there are wrongdoings towards workers or environment, human rights violations, for factory fires, things like that, killings of human rights defenders. So there needs to be liability, and this is very tough, but I think that otherwise this whole exercise is in a way meaningless. But I would say that the company would need to sort of, the board would need to be accountable as a whole, because it is a collective. It's a kind of a collective organ anyway. So, but what is your view of that?
I think I tend to agree with you. It is a collective responsibility, and it is by keeping this collective responsibility that you will actually have the board behave in an integrated way, with all the different directors bringing their own perspectives, specialty, competencies. So I think that is important, indeed. And finding the balance point, the tipping point with liability has always been a very difficult exercise. Nobody wants to see their liability increased, and one of the problems is that across Europe, we've got quite a diverse landscape in terms of liability regimes, which doesn't really match with globalization in a way, but that's where we are for plenty of historical reasons. I think it's interesting also to see that another point of controversy is also the competitiveness of EU companies, and the comment that I'm sure you've heard a number of times, that increasing the duties and the liability of EU companies might put them at a disadvantage in international competition. So as the Parliament had discussions, I'm sure, on that, but how do you see a way of breaching a fair balance here, a fair point of equilibrium?
Yeah, I think the most important answer to that is that I think everyone wants to see this future set of legislation to be applied to all companies operating in the EU internal market. Now I hear that perhaps the Commission wants to somehow dilute this, and I'm a bit worried, because I think this would be indeed a way to protect European companies and their competitiveness. Because if the same rules would apply to all operating in this, let's say, we are still the largest internal market in the world. That they may not last because of the demographic developments and China rising ever more, but it has a huge attraction also. That's what I hear from companies, that that's why the EU can be relatively confident that it can apply the same rules on non-European companies operating in Europe. So I think this is the most important thing, because there have been concerns that it would only be applied on European companies, but that would be very unfortunate, and I don't see this happening.
Well, we had this debate in a number of other fields, I mean, including on reporting, also on tax transparency, on quite a number of debates.
Yeah.
And if I hear you properly, what you're saying is that these rules should be applied to anyone willing to do business in the EU, willing to sell to EU clients, basically.
Yes, and there lies the let's say the momentum, because then there will be an immediate spillover effect beyond the EU, and that's why you mentioned that in Japan there's an awareness of what the EU is doing, and I hear that the US law firms are studying the intentions. I hope not in order to stop them. But so this is a real opportunity now, and it's exciting to be a part of all this at this moment when there is this growing realization that the way our societies have developed is not going to be lasting for very long if we want to save the planet and its people.
So again, this is a short-term duty,
Thank
right?
you. You really challenged me on that quite successfully, I
Well,
must say.
I think we do have to rethink what we mean by short-term and long-term and future generations. I mean, we've been talking about future generations for 40 years now.
Yes.
I'm afraid it's a matter for our generation, not any future one today. But anyway, looking at stakeholders' engagement, which is another big element of the debate here in the EU, I think there has been quite some worries in business that if you're trying to include too many stakeholders, to involve too many stakeholders, the company is going to be impossible to manage. So what is your view on the board responsibility towards stakeholders, and who do you think is best placed to know who a company's stakeholders are?
I think the company. And,
right.
But I don't make it easier by saying that also the stakeholders have a certain stance in addressing the company and that they should be listened to. But I think it really depends on the individual companies, how sensitive they are. And I have some experience from, for instance, I was the chair of an oversight body of Neste, the biggest producer of biodiesel in the world today, which developed from a fossil fuel company towards almost like, not completely, but mostly biofuels. And it was a hard lesson for them to understand that when environmentalists and indigenous peoples were criticizing them in their operations in Southeast Asia, that they were not enemies, they were actually friends. And then they started to invite them to talks, and they learned more and more where the problem is. So it really should be seen as an asset, but I don't think anybody can dictate who is my stakeholder. But I think there are certain basic things like it's normal these days that companies also involve their employees and the labor unions to be a part of the process. I think it would be very backward if that didn't happen, but there are other stakeholders outside the company as well.
Yeah, we still have quite significant cultural differences, I think,
yes.
Even in Europe, on the role of employees in companies.
But by the way, the ExxonMobil case is interesting because it shows that there are now activist investors.
Yeah.
You know, the sort of stakeholders jump into the role of activists and put pressure on the company. So Thomas L. Friedman called this democratic capitalism.
Yeah.
So we see all sort of different ways in which stakeholders can get engaged.
Indeed. You also have activist investors who look in the opposite direction at times. We've seen that in a number of recent cases as well. But I'm very interested to hear you confirm, actually, that the business of identifying stakeholders is the company's business. They are indeed best placed. But I think it's also important that we strike a good balance between shareholders and stakeholders, which is also probably something that the Parliament has been discussing, I'm sure.
Yeah, but then this whole world of shareholders is also changing.
It's also changing,
and I'm really looking forward to the Commission's new revised sustainable finance strategy. By the way, how I learned about the connection between sustainable finance and due diligence was that in the first Sustainable Finance Action Plan that the European Commission published in 2018, it was Timmermans and Katainen at that time, it was mentioned that it's necessary to have a due diligence mechanism in companies, because otherwise the investors would not know what they are investing in. So there's a very organic connection between all these, reporting obviously as well.
Yep.
So we are looking at a very interesting set of different mechanisms that need to sort of work smoothly together, as you said at one point.
Well, thank you very much, Heidi. I think we could continue talking for another couple of hours, probably, but unfortunately...
It's better for everyone that we stop
Probably at some point, especially better for you, because I'm sure you've got a lot to do in the Parliament. I think these are very interesting times indeed, where we do see a lot of change. So maybe we will welcome you again once this file has evolved a little bit. Do you have any final comments, any points that we haven't addressed that you'd like to make, or any concluding comments that you'd like to share with the audience today?
Well, let me say that Accountancy Europe, as you said, you've been working on sustainability in its various forms for 25 years, that there's quite an interesting combination and landscape of different people and organizations and companies that now are working together to the best possible European Union standards on due diligence, corporate reporting, sustainable finance. And I think this is a real asset, this cooperation between and the need to make sure that we learn together and that the outcome then is the most practicable framework for companies and the society.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think we ourselves, Accountancy Europe, are a very diverse body. And if we represent about 1 million professional accountants across Europe, these accountants work in very, very different fields, with a lot of them actually working in accountancy firms, a majority, firms of all sizes, so large firm, medium-sized firms, small firms, sole practitioners. But interestingly, something that a lot of people don't necessarily notice, a lot of the members of our members are working in business, in companies, or also in the public sector, courts of auditors and ministries of finance. So this is just, I think, one more piece of evidence that it's all about dialogue and it's all about cooperation.
Yes.
It's been a great pleasure to have you today, Heidi. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me here. Thanks.
Looking forward to the rest of your work. Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of this talk. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, this fireside chat. And corporate governance will remain on top of Accountancy Europe agenda. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye.